This has caused really serious political problems and protests in the streets from students across the UK. It started, of course, in Scotland. They were the first to release their results. It caused a huge backlash. Their U-turn on it was quite swift, and it saw 100,000 grades bumped up for those students in Scotland. It blew up again, though, of course, last week on Thursday when grades were released for the rest of the UK. So today we've seen a U-turn that brings all of the UK into line in England, Northern Ireland and Wales. But it really just shows, I think, that this is not a party political issue. These are different political parties, different leaders. They've all really struggled to get a hold of this. In Westminster today, focus turned to Gavin Willliamson, the Education Secretary, and his role. He had a media round this morning. It was cancelled. We had to wait until the afternoon to hear from him. Behind the scenes, the government have been blaming Ofqual, the regulator, and the algorithm that was used to assign these grades. Ofqual, though, have hit back. They have said that they were just trying to carry out the wishes of the government and to avoid grade inflation. The Education Secretary, who oversaw the downgrading of hundreds of thousands of A-level results, prompting days of exams chaos. Today, he got his result, a U-turn.
Of course, incredibly sorry for all those students who have been through this. So over the weekend, it became clearer to me that there were a level of the number of students who were getting grades that frankly they shouldn't have been getting and should have been doing a lot better. And the evidence, both from Ofqual and other external bodies, was apparent that action needed to be taken.
Outside the department, the students who led protests outside Parliament get news of the announcement.
Results to follow teachers' grades in exams U-turn. Yes! Let's go. Let's go. We did it. I feel great. The government's finally taking responsibility like they should have done weeks ago. They are owning up to their mistake and they're going off teachers' test grades, which is the fairest way without making people feel like they've lost faith in the system.
You both organised the protests, so do you feel like that made a difference?
Well, yeah, I do. I feel like, in the past few days there's been protests all around, and I think the biggest one was here. And I do think that the government have realised that they've messed up and that we're not going to stand for what they've done.
And I think this is a fantastic victory, but we still need to see Gavin Willliamson go.
Much of the blame has fallen on the regulator and the algorithm. Today they were apologetic.
We have recognised the difficulty that young people have faced coping with the receipt of grades that they were unable to understand the basis on which they had been awarded, and I would like to say sorry for that, and we are now taking steps to put that right.
So how did we get here? In March, schools were closed and exams cancelled. Then in April, Ofqual published new guidance for how grades would be awarded. 4 months later, Scotland released their results, and after a backlash, performed a U-turn. Under pressure to avoid the same backlash, Gavin Willliamson announced a triple lock, a safety net for students. A day later, results were released in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Protests followed, and today a policy U-turn on A-levels and GCSEs in all three countries.
Any other considerations are secondary to my prime concern to ensure that the young people in Northern Ireland are in no way disadvantaged in comparison to their peers elsewhere. These are truly unique circumstances, and this approach is now being adopted across all of the UK.
I do think we've got to learn lessons about this. We do have to think about how does Ofqual operate. Ironically, all the nations in the UK, all run by different political parties, have all ended up in the same place. So nobody actually can say I'm whiter than white in this.
But other Conservative MPs may not be as forgiving, after many felt compelled to speak out. Cabinet Office Minister Penny Mordaunt tweeted her concerns this morning, and that opened the door to a deluge of dissenting Conservative MPs demanding a change of direction, building on pressure from the opposition.
Well, Labour's been calling on the government to revert to teacher-assessed grades for days, so it's right that the government has finally made this U-turn. But you can't mask the frustration and anger and distress that this has caused thousands of young people and their families. And so, yet again, what we're seeing is a government that is slow and incompetent.
But others are still concerned.
But it certainly doesn't mean fairness. There will still be a lot of young people who miss out. It's still going to cause a lot of chaos for universities this year and in the future.
Is there anything, in your opinion, that can be done to prevent some of that future chaos?
Well, I think that the government are going to have to look at funding more university places overall. There is a limit to what can be done to resolve the problems that are going to be created by this mess. It also means that next year we absolutely have to have exams. There's no way this can be repeated, because there's no way schools are going to take any standardization process seriously next year. So it puts a lot of pressure both on the university system next year and on schools and the exam system next year.
In an effort to ease some of that pressure, the Education Secretary has said that the cap on university places will be lifted and that students will get another chance to get into their first choice institution. But as protesters descended on his constituency office in Staffordshire today, the question many would still like answered:
how would you grade yourself?
Well, my focus is, I always say it's probably best not to grade yourself. It's for other people to mark your homework.
But for many students still without a university place, that grade would be a U, for the uncertainty that many of them still feel for their futures.
So what now for the students who had their hopes dashed, then restored again, but only after days of uncertainty? Will they now be able to get the university or college places they had set their hearts on? Minnie Stevenson has been talking to some of the young people who've been caught up by a system in chaos.
It's been a complete struggle, and the application process for Cambridge, I did 2 interviews, I did an exam, I worked super hard and revised super hard for my A-levels. It's been really, really draining. And then to just have it all kind of randomly removed from me is really difficult.
Charlene's a straight A student, and yet the hardest work came from within, she told me, convincing herself she was good enough to even apply for Cambridge. Faith, hard work and her predicted A* and 2 A's earned her that place, only to have the now infamous algorithm steal her dream. Self-isolating in her council flat, Charlene told us while today's U-turn is welcomed, her confidence has been crushed.
Clearly, the algorithm did not look at me as an individual. It just kind of tried to fit me into a bunch of statistics, which felt very dehumanizing, actually. I think there was also a lack of thought into thinking, okay, how could this affect disadvantaged students? And I feel like maybe if there were more people in government who thought like that, we would have less issues. But clearly it was just not something that crossed their mind, which is actually really scary.
As for that now scrapped A-level algorithm, some question whether it was ever fit for purpose, after it emerged that the Royal Statistical Society had offered to advise the exam regulator Ofqual, but were told they'd have to sign non-disclosure agreements. They refused.
There's been a lack of transparency, and the RSS has been lobbying since the spring that there should be more transparency about this process, as have others, the House of Commons Select Committee. Had that happened, some of the technical mistakes would have been ironed out, and we would have had more clarity, and hopefully we could have fixed these issues about grade inflation too.
Entirely avoidable, say many, and students are angry. Hannah spent days and nights on her drawings, predicted a B in her art A-level. The algorithm awarded her a U.
The system has failed me. I don't think it's given me a fair grade at all, even though it claims to have done that. To do with the U-turn, I don't really think it should have happened in the first place. They shouldn't have had to have a solution for it, because they should have just given us our predicted anyway.
Lena lost her place at the London School of Economics after her grades were downgraded. She was among a group of students who had threatened to take legal action.
Really betrayed, my dreams of going to LSE here are kind of shattered. And the government promised to give us fair and reasonable grades. I've always wanted to go to LSE. LSE is the school I was really happy to get an offer from. And to have to walk away from that after being in lockdown for 5 months, getting to know the other students, meeting up, doing Zoom calls and stuff, to kind of let go of that and move on, that's just going to be really painful.
Lena and Charlene are still waiting to hear what the U-turn will mean for their university places, their hard-fought dreams uncertain this evening. The system which was supposed to serve them leaves a generation disillusioned.
Well, I'm here at the Ernest Bevin College, a community school in South London, teaching 11 to 19-year-olds, and with me is the head teacher, Anne Cain-Marr. Anne Cain-Marr, I don't know, as an outsider, you look in and you say, look, the pandemic's been going for 5 months. OK, give them a bit of leeway and say they didn't realise until, say, 3 months ago that they were in a mess. Couldn't this have been sorted out months ago, or did it have to be a road crash?
I think when it was first suggested that there would be no examinations, certainly as a teaching profession, we got the guidance we received from Ofqual, and we carried that out both honestly and robustly. And we thought that that would be what the children received as our professional judgment as to their likely performance in the exams. Once the introduction of the standardisation model came into place through the algorithm, we did have a sense, and I think many people had a sense, that things were going to not turn out quite the way it appeared, especially when we knew that if you had groups over 15, actually it was just the algorithm.
Well, talk to me about the algorithm. There was more than one tried out, right? How many?
Our understanding is that they did try a few. I don't know exactly how many.
Some say as many as 7.
Maybe, I don't know. They certainly had different groups working on it and to work out exactly what the impact of it would be. And presumably this is the one that they thought ultimately would be the most effective.
How has this affected your students here? This is a school, you know, I mean, it's not a sort of rich area or anything. How's it affected them?
I think that on Thursday, it would be true to say we had a high number of disappointed children. Out of all of the grades that we received, 122 were dropped by 1 grade. And that had a big impact on their choices going on to university. Now, most of them have actually got a place, but they're not necessarily the places they desired or indeed the places they would have got. And now we're left with the difficulty of knowing whether or not those placements will be honoured going forward.
But given that it seems to be pretty clear they had some doubts about the algorithm themselves and that they had difficulty choosing the right one, I mean, they must have known that this might well happen.
There will be things that they must have known. They must have known that it would reduce the grades because that was what they were worried about. They were obviously very concerned that there would be grade inflation. But the difficulty with the tasks we were asked to carry out is that we can't be aware of what child might get to their exam and become nervous or get to their exam with a broken leg or somebody in the family might have died. Any of those things could affect those children's outcomes. But for us as teachers, we were being asked to make the best judgment we could as to what they would achieve, given the work that we had seen and the evidence that we had got.
And very briefly, the Secretary of State has criticised Ofqual for all this, who is a sort of regulator. Do you feel that way?
I don't think that I would blame Ofqual. My guess would be that they were expected to bring about a certain outcome, and I don't think it's gone very well, but mainly because they keep changing the parameters.
Head teacher Anne Cain-Marr, thank you very much indeed for talking for us. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Well, we did ask to speak to the Education Secretary, a Department for Education Minister, or a member of the government tonight, but no one was available. But the MP, Sir Bob Neal, who you saw in Liz Bates's report, joins us now from his constituency in South East London. Sir Bob Neal, thanks very much for joining us. Given at the weekend, just 2 days ago, Gavin Willliamson, the Education Secretary, said no U-turn, no change. What does this very rapid U-turn now say about his leadership and indeed the leadership of the government?
Well, it's never wise to box yourself in too much. But I think what has happened here is that a perfectly understandable desire not to have unnecessary grade inflation took over policy far too much. Nobody wants to see any grade inflation more than's necessary, but I think that became the driving factor in all of this, and that's why there was such a rigid adherence to using an algorithm, which does have the weaknesses that you've been talking about. And what wasn't sufficiently taken into account was its inability to pick up on individual circumstances and the harm that that would do to individual students and the pressure that put on them and their families, including many in my constituency, which is why I said, unless they could come up with a robust appeal system by the end, frankly, of today, then they should go back to the predicted grades, and I'm glad that they have.
Well, the Education Secretary appears to be passing the blame to Ofcom, but given that he instructed Ofqual not to see a kind of broad grade inflation, shouldn't he take the blame? Are you surprised he's still in his job?
I'm not interested, actually, in whose job is held by whom at the moment. What I'm interested in is making sure that we iron out, first of all, any remaining issues. For example, making sure that those students who have so far lost places but now have had their grades increased as a result of this can perhaps get the universities that they deserve to. So I'm pleased that the government's increased or abolished the cap on university places. But I've got a real concern, for example, about medical schools, where there's always oversubscription. I've got some very bright medical students who at the moment might still lose out. So I want to get the students looked after first, and then we can think about apportioning blame thereafter. But there does have to be a lot more transparency about the whole process.
But he's living on borrowed time, the Education Secretary.
As I say, I'm not interested in speculating about that. My colleague Robert Halfon, the chair of the Education Select Committee, pointed out that they had made a very good report not too long ago, highlighting the need for people to be absolutely transparent about what's happening. And I'm particularly concerned that we know why isn't it that the best statistical advice wasn't brought in sooner in the process to see, I'd have hoped earlier on, whether an algorithm system was ever going to be viable, or we shouldn't have wasted time on that.
Well, given that the government has had months to plan for this, ever since March, really, are you surprised that it is now the policy has hastily been ditched over a weekend? What does that say about the government?
Well, I think everybody has had to move at some speed on this, and everybody has actually had to deal with a new and completely unprecedented set of circumstances. It wouldn't be actually right to simply point the finger at the government in England over this, because other governments of other parties, the Scottish National Government in Scotland, the Welsh Government in Wales, and the coalition government, the power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland, have all actually come to the same conclusion. So nobody is in a position to be holier than that about this. All of us have had to learn.
But couldn't Gavin Willliamson have seen Nicola Sturgeon take her decision and just react then? At least that would have saved, a few weeks of bother for these students.
I have said I think it would have been better if we could have moved more swiftly, but I think you could say that about why didn't that happen in Wales and Northern Ireland too? We can all be wise after the event, but clearly what's important now is to make sure they did take the right decision eventually, and now we've got to sort out the practical issues that stem from that to make sure that students don't lose out. That's the most important thing.
So Bob Neal, thanks very much for joining us. Well, with me now is the Vice-Chancellor of Birmingham City University, Professor Philip Plowden, and thank you very much for joining us here on this rainy night here. 150,000 students could be changing university as a result of this U-turn. How on earth are universities like yours going to manage that chaos?
Well, I think the starting point has to be that this is, at the end of the day, very good news. I think universities as a whole want to do the right thing for their students and their students' families, and there was just this deep sense that the previous system was not fair. It wasn't delivering the right grades. So let's welcome that. But as you say, yes, it's going to be a really challenging few days. This is going to be the third time in a week that we've gone through all the applicants to our university to try and make sense of what grades they've got.
And presumably, quite a few students had this as a second choice. They might now be looking at tearing up that offer that you've given them and going for a different university. How many do you estimate might be in that position?
I think at this stage it's very hard to tell. We went very early with the view that we would accept predicted grades. We trusted the teachers to get those grades right in the first place. So what we're hoping is that the kids to whom we've made offers during clearing are the kids who actually want to come here. And if we lose some because their first choice university is now available to them, equally some that we've had to turn down because their original grades weren't up to scratch, we may now be able to take.
But they're entitled to change their minds. You're perfectly happy for them to do that, even if it leaves you with a big financial hole.
I don't think it will is the answer, but I think for universities around the country, there will be some for whom this is very, very challenging. Because you have to remember, this is going to be a really difficult year anyway. COVID alone is adding hugely to the costs that universities incur with social distancing and masks and all the rest of it. So to have this degree of chaos on top is really unhelpful.
And if the government's lifting the cap on numbers at universities in England, that will benefit Russell Group universities, won't it, with these higher grades that students are going to be getting?
Well, the assumption then is that Russell Group universities somehow have the capacity to take huge numbers more and to teach them to the standard that they would wish to offer. And I just don't think that's going to be the case.
That implies that some students will still be disappointed as a result. They won't get to that. They won't get, you know, their grades might be great on paper, but they might not get their first choice after all.
But isn't that always the case? I think what we're struggling with here is the impact of COVID. It doesn't actually magically ensure that every student gets to go to whichever university it is that they really aspire to go to. What we've probably got is just a more sensible way of assessing what grades these kids would have had they been able to sit the exams in the first place.
But this could well exacerbate financial pressures on universities. There could be some go bust as a result of all of this?
I think financial pressures have been building up for universities over a number of years. I think COVID has been very, very challenging for a lot of universities, and there'll be some out there in the sector for whom this may be an additional challenge.
Birmingham City not going to be asking for a government bailout?
No, Birmingham City is always happy if the government chooses to recognise what we do and give us support.
You've been talking about the financial pressures of coronavirus, but I mean, there are other equally obvious pressures. How much face-to-face teaching are you going to be able to do for students here in the autumn?
Well, again, we took a very early view on this one, that students had to have certainty on what they could expect. So we made a pledge. We said that the majority of teaching in the coming year would be face-to-face, and that's what we're going to deliver. But it does mean we have to maintain social distancing. It means we have to ensure we have masks and all the rest of that in place to keep our students and our staff safe.
And just finally, our last guest, Sir Bob Neal, didn't want to lay the blame at anybody's door. Who do you blame for this fiasco? Ofqual, the Education Secretary, Boris Johnson?
I think finding out who's responsible for this is probably more your job than mine, but what I would say is it is a bit disappointing to find that something that we knew that was going to happen, like A-level grades, that wasn't sorted out at an earlier point.